It's really wonderful to have you all join us. Thank you very much for making time coming on. And I think as far as the topic for today's discussion is concerned, you must have become quite familiar with it. The idea was to speak about the situation post-COVID and where we are and the lessons we've learned, based on which the thought was that how can corporate sector, should the corporate sector deepen their responsibility, and essentially the way we looked at it is broadening corporate sector priorities. Should they include way beyond just what they are used to look at? So in fact, the world as we know it has changed, and there is really no looking back, or so it seems. We've never in our lifetime seen things being so uncertain. Our future hasn't ever appeared so uncertain. Whether you look at food security, there seems to be chaos. Whether we look at political situations, there seems to be chaos. Whether we look at economic situations, there seems to be chaos. And everyone needs to really look at their priorities, draft new plans, importantly, maybe take on new roads, even the roads that have been less traveled. And the same augurs for the guys who really drive and who used to drive the economies of the world, and that we believe is the corporate sector. So the question really came from there: should they be redefining their way forward? And are there any lessons from this experience and this crisis that we have gone through for the corporate sectors as well, and for how businesses are done? Are there lessons from this lockdown as well? And if they do look at redefining, how should they? What could be the way forward? Can they get more involved? I mean, of course, we're not talking about profits not being the priority. Sure, business has to run that, but can we broaden the priorities and include other things? And for that, for these issues to discuss, the India perspective and the US perspective, I've got two wonderful people with me today, whom I have deep personal respect for as well. And I'd like to introduce you to them. From India, Luis Miranda. He's the chairman of the Center for Civil Society and Coro. He has been involved in setting up two highly successful companies, HDFC Bank and IDFC Private Equity. He is a co-founder today of the Indian School of Public Policy, and he sort of spends a lot of his time with his wife, as he says, connecting the dots, using their networks to help the organizations they're connected with. He is also on the board of Educate Girls and the State Bank of India Foundation, and he's a co-founded Take Charge, a mentoring program for Catholic youth in Mumbai. Louis is also chairman of Manipal Cigna Health Insurance and a senior advisor to Morgan Stanley. He is a trustee of the U Chicago Trust in India and a member of the advisory council of the Rastandi Center for Social Sector Innovation at Chicago Booth. And Spontaneous Thrive Global. He blogs for a number of places, including Forbes, Thrive Global, and Spontaneous Order, and teaches at the Accelerated Development Program of Chicago Booth. Louis received an MBA from the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago and is a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. And quickly, I would also like to introduce Christina Preto, who's our a leader in her business. Both the speakers we have are, luminary leadership people whom not many of us actually have known for many years, and they're so well established and respected in their domains. So Christina is currently the Managing Director and Global Head of Communications and Public Affairs for Lone Star Funds, an $80 billion private equity firm that specializes in opportunities emanating from economic distress. We're right in the middle of it, including banking crises. Christina leads the communications, media relations, philanthropy, digital strategy, and public affairs for Lone Star and its asset manager, Hudson Advisors. She also directs communications for all the fund's portfolio companies and the asset pools. Prior to joining Lone Star, She served as Senior Vice President and Global Group Head Corporate Com for American International Group. And for 7 years, she led their efforts to revive AIG's reputation following the US government's $182 billion rescue of the company in 2008. There's so much more that I could say for both these people, but I think the profiles have been shared with all of you in the invitations, and I would love you to go through that. So coming back to the subject for today's discussion, and the introduction that I had presented there. So I would like to request Louis, if you may start with your perspective on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Madhulika, and for the invitation to speak today and for the introduction. I want to actually look at what happened 50 years back. This is the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's article in the New York Times, which was a title, "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." And at that time in the 70s, there was a lot of opposition to big corporate America, to big corporations, to the profits they were making. People felt they were bad. And you come 50 years later, it's the same. It's the same as it was 50 years back. And the reason I brought it up is today Friedman's got a lot of criticism over the years for being fully focused on money. But as you look at what's happening in the world, and that's the proposition I want to make, it's still very important for businesses to focus on making money. But let's go back actually to what he actually said, what he wrote at that time. And this is what he actually, I'm just going to read it out. There is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. And that second part is what normally doesn't get talked about. He never talked about, focusing only on profits without and ignoring the rules of the game, doing things illegally, etc. So what he said is there are rules of the game, there are rules around it, and within that framework, you focus on making profit. And there is a difference, he said, between the corporate and the individuals behind it. So when you look, for example, at the role of the government's role is to look after the interests of a lot of the people who otherwise need benefits. And that's something which the government does or is supposed to do. And he said that there are individuals. Individuals have a responsibility also to society. So it's the businesses which focus on making money, and it's the shareholders, the beneficiaries of the profits from the businesses, who can therefore spend money on looking after issues related to their community, to their church or their temple, or to other people who are deprived in society. And the point, therefore, I'm trying to make is that in today's world, when we look at the challenges we're facing economically, it is important for companies also to focus on making the profits and focusing on the economic growth of their businesses. But what does that mean in today's world? Today, people are saying that, we've not just focused on the money you make, but you've got a larger responsibility to society. And Milton Friedman talked about that. He said, for example, in the same paper 50 years back, that if you're involved, if you're a major player in the community that you work in, it makes business sense to focus on developing the community around you. It makes sense because then you can employ better people, you'll have better loyalty to your organization, and that makes sense in the long run. So the fact that you have to ignore society or the community in order to make profit also doesn't make sense. So helping society, helping the companies, the societies, communities you are in, is important also to be able to focus on making profits. You can't ignore that to be able to succeed in the long term. And companies which ignore that have suffered in the long term. Companies like Enron, for example, which ignore the communities that they worked in, or some of the oil companies who ignore the communities that they worked in, they suffer in the long term. So you've got to be able to do that. Similarly, if you find people excessively spending money on extravagant stuff, you will get impacted in the long term. Private equity funds earned that reputation. When people found that they were being too extravagant, there was a lot of pushback, and then these firms got hit badly by tax rules, etc. Today, you're seeing also a lot of investors coming in who are focused on ESG issues. You see impact investors coming in, trying to focus on all the issues that they deem important. So there'll be some companies who will say, investors who will say, I won't invest in a polluting business, or I won't invest in a business that makes arms. And that's again, driven by the investor focus on it. And these investors are the ones who drive what the business does. But again, remember, all these impact investors, ESG investors, also have an IRR target. They are, at the end of the day, also investing their investors' money to make money. Today, so that's one part of it, which is the focus of businesses hasn't changed in my view. It's been always to make money, and it will continue to be to make money. But in order to make money, you've also got to look at society. You can't just look at doing whatever you wanted, and that's what Friedman talked about. Let's look at some of the activities that are happening today, because today you're seeing actually a strange situation where the government and society sometimes looks at corporates and says, you're the bad guys. And then when you see what's happened in the last 3 months with COVID happening, and the sort of suffering that has been all around, and then you look back and say, who are the people making the PPEs? It's the private sector. Who are the people who are supplying the food to a lot of the people who've been impacted, the migrant workers and the people who've been displaced by the daily wagers, who've been lost their income? The non-profit sector, funded by donations from the private sector. People, hospitals. Today the government has announced in Mumbai that all private doctors have to come and work in the government hospitals. Sanitizers are being made by the private sector. So you see, there is a large benefit of what the private sector has been doing when it's focusing on the end results. Because a lot of things which the government wants, what people want is actually what the government should do. But governments work at their own pace, and it's easier, therefore, to force corporates to do that and do roles that actually the government was supposed to do so. And it's reflected in the way people vote also. So what happened in 2014? Modi came about saying, I'm going to fight again, I'm going to go on a plank against corruption, I'm going to focus on getting things done, I'm going to get the economy on track, I'm going to focus on more governance, less government. What happened later may have been different, but the point is that's what people voted for. And similarly in the US, Bernie Sanders, who was very popular when he talked about a lot of sort of socialist ideas, fell aside. He didn't get the nomination. Elizabeth Warren, who pushed through the Accountable Capitalism Act, she also didn't get voted. So people at the end of the day also have realized that you need to let corporates also have a large role over there to play. I'm going to stop now, and we'll continue the conversation. Back to you, Madhulika.
Thanks, Louis. That was really insightful, and I think very interesting to look at the big picture as well as some of the finer points that you have raised. And I also agree, and I think most of the people will agree that the focus of the business hasn't changed, but there is definitely scope to look at what else there is. But before we get into a further discussion, and then we later take on some questions from the audience as well, many have already come in, I'd like to move over to Christina and request Christina for the US perspective on this subject.
Thank you, Madhulika and Luis, and thank you to the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce for sponsoring this. And I must particularly thank you, Madhulika, for organizing this. So it's wonderful to connect with all of you out there in the digital ether. As like Madhulika and Luis, I have spent a lot of my career actually in discussions, frankly, like this one, asking what is the role of companies in strengthening communities. And those conversations immediately, and it didn't even, I didn't even really observe this actually till we were prepping for this call. Those conversations almost always would begin automatically with the explicit statement, but we're a business and our job is to make money, so we cannot lose our focus on that. And there has always been in the world of ESG and, as you mentioned, impact investing. And I'm so glad you brought up that Milton Friedman article, because over time that concept of a corporation's core obligation is to its shareholders has in effect been embedded in US corporate law. And I would, for those of you who would like to pursue this in fine detail, there's a really interesting article actually that a former Simpson Thacher lawyer named Jamie Gamble wrote about how the reason it is so difficult, particularly in the United States, for corporations to broaden their focus on, let's say, stakeholders and activities that transcend that core obligation to make decisions that are fundamentally in the interest of shareholders. It's embedded in Delaware law, and Delaware is the state in the United States that in which most large companies incorporate. And recently, before the COVID pandemic, the largest lobbying organization for business in the United States, the Business Roundtable, actually came out with a statement that got a lot of attention, which was really acknowledging the erosion of trust. And if you look at the data, the erosion of trust in the corporate sector and all institutions really in the world, and in government, in the media, but including in corporations, trust is at an all-time low. And people want corporations to take on a larger voice, a larger leadership role in really defining what is healthy and advocating for what is healthy for society at large. And the Business Roundtable came out and said, we acknowledge that we have an obligation to connect with and advocate for the stakeholders of our business, so going beyond shareholders. But what I wanted to get back to is this sense of, as the culture of business, as much as the legal infrastructure of business, there's a certain fear that I think that I've observed anyway. There's a fear that if we start to really get serious about advocating, if you will, for the totality of the health of communities, obviously from the perspective of whatever a given business plays in that ecosystem, as a worry though. Oh my goodness, maybe we'll get distracted. Oh my goodness, maybe we'll have to migrate energy and resources to which we are right now solely devoting to our business, making money. Maybe we are going to have to migrate some of that energy and effort and resource away from pure profit making into other activities. And then, oh my goodness, is that going to essentially degrade, weaken, lessen the amount of money that I'm going to make? And that feels scary. But I think one of the reasons we're having this conversation right now, and why it has taken on a renewed sense of resonance, is because we are seeing and experiencing the profound need for all aspects of a community to be supported and protected in the midst of a complete disruption to business. So we need to think about and what has emerged. I don't know if this concept has emerged in other countries, but in the US, we are talking a lot right now about essential workers versus non-essential workers. And who does it turn out is essential? The people who are selling us groceries every day, the people who are in the agriculture sector, who are working in meat processing plants and picking vegetables and fruit. And these groups of workers, unfortunately, have been among the most marginalized and sadly, in many sectors, even attacked for their desire to have a stable life and come and work. So there's a big conversation going on in the US about one, and I think this is very powerful and encouraging, the integral role that thousands and thousands, if not millions, of somewhat invisible workers are playing in our lives, and the need to make sure that their health and safety is protected. And I think our business leaders are starting to see that they can take a more explicit leadership role in advocating for what will ensure in the long run, as Luis pointed out, in the long run, what will be best for their customers and for their reputations in their communities. So I hope that is a good comment, and I will stop there and turn it over to you, Madhulika.
Okay, thanks a lot, Christina, and that was very insightful as well. You know, we're getting a lot of questions from people, and before I take on some of the questions from the audience, there's something I would like to bring up, which has come up in discussions before, which is that, you know, when we're talking about the focus of the businesses, you spoke about the inclusion of other aspects to it. Louis spoke about a number of aspects as well. I think very importantly, at least in the India experience, something that is generally causing a lot of concern is, and Louis, you would know this very well, which is, you know, the base of business, at least when it comes to manufacturing, in the bigger cities where the bigger factories are, it's really the migrant labor that's been down there. But what is happening is, and what we've seen during this current crisis, is that the migrant labor has been literally left bereft. Who should be thinking of taking a responsibility up the chain? I mean, ultimately, they are the guys who are working in the factories. Then there are, you know, MSMEs who's working over that to supply. Many of them down the supply chain, if you know what I'm trying to explain over here, the entire connection. You know, there's a supply chain where at the bottom of it, at the bottom of that pyramid, if I may use that expression, is the migrant labor. And I mean, it's only been left to the either NGOs or civil societies or administrative wings of the government to look at it. The companies who made money out of that manufacturing actually shut their eyes, close their doors, and walk. Or is that a misconception, or is that something we're not understanding right? So that's one aspect of it. If you could touch on it, then there's one more that I'd like to bring up. Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at the migrant labor situation, because that's been the most visible impact in India when people saw those videos and pictures of long lines of people trying to get home to their villages. And I think it's what Christina was talking about yesterday, is that a lot of people who suddenly have been found to be very essential are the invisibles. We talked about it yesterday. And they're the people who we just took for granted. And you didn't realize how important they were to our lives. The people living in the slums who worked on sanitation, who worked on construction sites, etc. A lot of the people who came from different states in search of a living. And when this problem blew up, I contacted an organization that I chair, an organization called Coro. And we do grassroots leadership training, and we work with communities. And I reached out to them saying, listen, what can we do to help the people who are being impacted, the daily wage earners, who, for example, today aren't getting jobs and no income. And we don't, and Coro doesn't do relief work, but we've done a bit of it when we were in, during the floods and the riots in the past. And so they said they quickly swung into action because you've got these crisis resource centers. And we identified, within a few hours, we identified 120 families in M East Ward in Chembur. And, and that sort of, exponentially grew. And we've, since then, we've supplied over 9,000 families food, which is like, 9 lakh meals supplied, etc. But the point is that, we quickly realized that these people needed help because there was no one else helping them. And it's not that they wanted money, because even if you gave them money, transferred money to their bank accounts, there was no way for them to buy food because it was not available. Supply chains had hurt. So we did a fundraiser, and we found that the easiest parts at that time was really raising the money and identifying the beneficiaries. But getting the food to them was a tough part because all the large grocery stores, etc., the chains, retail chains, yes, their supply chains had been hit, and there wasn't, and the staff wasn't coming to work. So it became a huge challenge, and then we sort of, and then a lot of NGOs therefore stepped in. And what we came in with was saying that we needed to step in now, and then the government will, get the PDS system, the public the distribution system in place, and therefore we will then step back. But it's been over 6 weeks, and we still see a lot of people struggling. We've actually, in some places, the government delivery systems has kicked in, and in other places they haven't yet. But because in some places people are just being left out of the system. So, for example, if you have a ration card and it's linked to your village in Chhattisgarh, you won't get food, you won't get ration supplies in Mumbai. Or if you're a single widow in a lot of places in Bhid, etc., you don't have a ration card, you don't get supplies. So a lot of people are being impacted. Kids, for example, who would go to school and get a midday meal, their nutrition. Schools are closed, so they don't get that nutrition today. So we've actually presented a list to the government saying these are the areas that, these are the people who are being left out, and if we need to include them in to make the schemes more inclusive. And now you come back again to migrant. I was talking to one of my friends who's a large real estate developer. And I was shocked when he told me, Louis, don't worry, all our workers are getting food from the government. It's not great, it's just rice and dal maybe, but they're getting. And the question which I didn't ask him was, why aren't you then stepping in and making sure that they get looked after? And to me, the biggest shocker, and it's not something which I only read in the papers and I haven't sort of been able to verify it. In Bangalore, the government was sending people out. They were organizing transport for them to go back to their villages in UP or wherever. And then there was allegedly a meeting with the construction industry, the real estate industry, and then they decided not to let those people go back because they needed to do work back in Bangalore. And that's bad, because you're effectively saying that, you're forcing them to stay back, even though they are worried about their own lives, they're worried about their families, they want to go back home. So these invisibles in society have now become very visible. We've seen that happen in Singapore also. Singapore had a great track record of controlling it, and then suddenly discovered that there are a lot of migrant workers who were living 20 people in a room, and they were the ones who suddenly sort of, started bursting, and the numbers started exploding when they were suddenly discovered. And you talk, for example, about the meat industry, and Christine was talking about that, and how working in a meat processing plant is a high infection area. So all these people who we've taken for granted have suddenly become very visible, and I think we owe a responsibility to them. And we've seen some people step up. We've seen corporates step up. We've seen the non-profits set up. We've seen governments step in, and clearly a lot more effort and a lot of cost is going to go into helping these people.
Yeah, thanks. Before I come to you, Christina, to elaborate on the essential, non-essential worker aspect that Louis was referring to from our conversation, there's a related question, Louis, that's come up, which I'd like you to address. It says, how can civil societies map and convert migrant skill and knowledge into livelihood and boost up rural economy? I think the result is it need not be so much migration then if there can be a greater boost of rural economy in the rural areas. Would you like to take that question?
Sure. I mean, ideally, if you could create opportunities for them to work back in their villages or in their smaller communities, they have a better standard of life. They don't have to live in tiny little apartments in a big city, cramped. So yes, one of the organizations I'm involved with is 17,000 Feet Foundation. We work in Ladakh, and the aim is really to work on these frontier villages. Because if people keep leaving these frontier villages, it's a security risk, because that first line of getting information from the villagers goes away. But the fact is that a lot of these people, kids, youngsters, are leaving those villages because they have no source of income. So it's and if you look at it, how many jobs can be created over there? You will have friends of mine, for example, who set up outsourcing businesses in the rural parts of the country, but they will still remain small. Economies of scale therefore mean that you come to a larger place and aggregate together and create that. That's pure economics over here. So you will have people working in smaller places, but it's good that as population grows, you're not going to be able to assimilate as many people into the workforce in these places back over there. There will always be anecdotal stories. Like at Koro, we work on livelihoods, where we work on forest rights. And therefore, in certain villages attached to a forest, we'd work where people can make a livelihood from the forest, and therefore they don't need to migrate because they're making their money from the forest. So this particular village, they have 2 crore, that's 20 million rupees in their bank account, because all the work that they've been doing, working for making a livelihood from the forest. But these are anecdotal stories. You will still have migration, because all across, economies of scale make people want to migrate. And the question is, you need more centers across as opposed to only a few large places. So the governments have been trying to create these magnets in different places to attract businesses together. The old industrial zones, which were there, the MIDCs, etc., were set up to be able to be magnets. But then again, due to bad policies, some of them died out. But I think it will be utopian to expect that everyone's going to be able to make a livelihood sitting back in their village. No, some people will have to move, but I think we can do a lot more to create opportunities for some of these people back over there. Skilling. So, for example, there's the Pani Foundation together with Godrich have been working on, and others have been working on, how do you teach kids in village schools also farming? Because otherwise you're putting them through a school system. You're putting them through a school system which teaches them geography, history, math, etc. But you haven't taught them how to be a better farmer. So why can't you teach that in the classroom also? So that's what they're doing. They put that into the curriculum. So while you're at school learning all these fancy things, you also learn how to be a better farmer. You learn about agriculture, you learn about the weather, you learn about things which can then help you be a better farmer when you become grown up. So some of those activities are very important to look at in villages.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's very interesting as far as what can happen with the skills of the people. But somebody was also asking, I mean, isn't it, it might be worth an idea to explore where companies who have these factories, can they take some of those factories into rural areas? Maybe the government can also collaborate to help incentivize that. So many of the workforce who are actually coming from villages can probably get employment where they are when it's off season from agricultural produce perspective.
Sure, and attempts have been made across, but the question is, how do you sort of make that more sustainable in the long term? So you look at Maharashtra, there are so many of these industrial zones all over the place. Some of them are ghost towns. They've been neglected because either the infrastructure hasn't come in. To me, the biggest sort of way to help a lot of these people is really improving roads, the road system. I mean, the Golden Quadrilateral and the east-west, north-south roads were fabulous catalysts in terms of bringing the markets and connecting people in villages to the outside world. Because now they can transport their material across at a much faster pace here. So improving logistics, etc. And effectively what I'm saying is business solutions will actually create more opportunities for them. And that's, so just improving the quality of infrastructure. You've seen it happening now. You just drive down the highways, and my wife, kids, and I, we spent a month on the road driving from Mumbai to Ladakh 5 years back. And it was just fascinating to see the way some of these economies grew. And on this fabulous stretch of road we were driving in Rajasthan, very impressive road. We saw a lot of construction happening along the way. A few years later, I'm on the board of an organization called Educate Girls. And we visited a village, a hamlet rather, about 200 meters away from the highway, the same highway we'd driven. And in that hamlet, the world hadn't changed from 1947. So you can imagine how bad they would have been, if these roads hadn't happened up. This change would take so much longer.
Yeah.
So connectivity, the electricity, phones, mobile phones have changed so much over here. Again, sorry, but they're all driven by the private sector to a large extent.
Great. Christina, could you elaborate a little bit more on this? Because we've been talking about labor and workforce, could you elaborate a little bit from the perspective of the essential and non-essential workers that you were speaking about? And how does that fit into this context today in the scenario that we have been seeing right now and the crisis that we're facing?
Sure. The shock of suddenly one day we all had to stay home, right? And at first it was novel, and I think I'll just speak for myself. When I had to go home and not leave, I thought, I wasn't sure how long it would be, but I probably, if you'd asked me at the time, I'd be like, oh, it's going to be a couple of weeks. And I think that we've all had sort of this slow sinking in experience of, oh my goodness, this is going to go on. At least here, I'm in New York, and as I'm sure all of you have read, the state of New York and the city of New York are by far the most dramatically affected. We've had the highest number of infections and deaths, sadly, in the entire United States. And so New Yorkers are home, and the same is probably true of just about everybody across the country. And as this goes on, week after week after week, we're finding that things are starting to be in short supply. It's not terrible yet, and I don't think anyone wants it to be terrible, but we're experiencing shortages of dairy products and meat products. Why? Because as workers in the beginning of the agricultural supply chain, literally on the farms, on the ranches, in the meat processing plants, in the food processing plants, they are getting infected, and they're sick, and they rightly want to stay home and not risk their families getting sick. So as that trickles to the consumer, we're starting to really focus and see, yes, what was invisible to us is suddenly becoming visible, that there are people behind the work of real people behind that package of chicken thighs wrapped in plastic that I buy at the supermarket. And boy, do I wish that there was plenty there. And I think we're grappling with the contrast, if you will, between the absolute abundance in the United States that we've been very blessed to have, with what we haven't paid much attention to, which is how all that food and other essential services that we're starting to recognize are so essential, how that all happens. And the other a group of workers that I think we're starting to have a renewed appreciation for is our healthcare. Those in healthcare, our nurses, our doctors, our licensed clinical nurses, because they are going into these hospitals and they are also literally risking their lives for the safety of the community. And what it's kind of forcing us in the United States and perhaps all over the world to do is recognize that every person involved in the economy is essential, and the people who are lower paid are turning out to be perhaps the most essential. And I think it started, in fact, just today, this morning in the New York Times, there's an editorial, an opinion piece by the head of the AFL-CIO, which is one of the largest of our few labor unions here in the US, saying that if we want these meat processing plants to reopen, because many of them are being shut down because they are temporarily, we hope, because people can get sick. And the head of the AFL-CIO is saying if we want these plants to reopen, we must make them safe. And in the United States, we go through these waves in our history of intense focus, especially when there's a massive economic disruption, and probably the last really significant one that resulted in serious reform for labor was the Great Depression. After the Great Depression, many important laws were passed. Also, there's a famous story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in the city of New York, where these ladies in the 20s were working in a lot because the owners of the factory didn't want them going anywhere. They wanted them working on those machines, making the clothes. And that incident, women were throwing themselves out of the windows to save themselves, and they died. And that resulted in some of the best and strictest fire codes in the world. And to this day, if you work in a building in the city of New York, twice a year, someone from the fire department comes and takes you on a very specific fire drill to make sure you know where the exits are and you know how to get out of your building. And that is all because a group of women died almost 100 years ago because they were locked in the factory. So fast forward to today, we're starting to really think about, I think, what is necessary to ensure the safety, because so often the safety of workers, because the safety of workers is critically important, not only for the workers, but for the entire community, for the entire, supply chain is a rather antiseptic way of talking about how we all live together in this world and are able to eat and drink and be merry. And so I think we in business have a real opportunity to recognize and play a leadership role and advocate for our people, especially those people on the front lines of making our businesses work. When you're advocating for the interests, and the best leaders I've ever worked for, I must say, are leaders who said employees first and meant it. Because they were thinking about how when a business leader really thinks about, let's say, the lowest paid worker in their organization, and that worker's daily life at work, but also at home. Why is that worker working? So that they can bring some money home and build a good life for themselves and a family. When a leader at the top of the organization is thinking about those people, then it becomes rather natural to A, consider them essential, and B, what do we need for everyone in order for our economies to work well? So that's, I think, something that we're really, it's starting to sink in a bit here in the United States as we don't see in the supermarket what we're used to seeing. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does. Thank you, Christina. Louis, yeah.
Just want to, so taking on from what Christina was saying on how you treat staff, and I like the way you said the best leaders are those who said employees first. When PM Cares, which was the big sort of announcement made by the Prime Minister about how you'll raise money for COVID aid, and then with a lot of fanfare, they announced it on at the end of March or 1st of April. And a lot of companies jumped in and pledged money to do it, and they raised about $1 billion, $2 billion. And it was, it really sucked up a lot of money from the system, which is great as long as it comes back. But it's some of these same companies who made big donations then went and announced that they're going to be salary cuts and layoffs for their employees. So these are people who are working for you. They're impacted by COVID. Look after your own employees, as opposed to, giving money to the government to get brownie points and then laying off the people who've actually helped you make your money to where you are today. And that's, irresponsible behavior of corporates. And it's interesting, one of my friends is actually trying to get the data of all the companies who said they're giving money to PM Cares and whether they've laid off people or cut down salaries. And that's not showing that you care for your people. That's irresponsible management. Secondly, it's also important when we talk about social responsibility, about how you behave as a good corporate citizen. And there's a friend of mine, she has an engineering company in Pune, and they've been very vocal about saying we will never pay a bribe. And a lot of their work is to do with government businesses. But they've gone on and said that's what we're going to do. And is going to impact businesses, and shareholders then can decide whether I want to be a shareholder in this company or not. Maybe you're not going to grow as fast. But that's the value system set up by the shareholders, who then sort of decide what goes down into the company to be able to do that. These are 2 points I just wanted to bring up on what Christina had talked about.
Yeah. No, thanks a lot. In fact, Louis, that was the second question that I had with me, aside from the skills of migrant labor and so on, was to do with the layoffs and all that we've been seeing. So I'm really, really glad that you touched upon that one. That's whether it's United States or India, I think anywhere around the world, this whole thing of employment and layoffs is an issue that is faced in different degrees. Some of the other questions I'd like to get onto, which have come in from the audience. What is the role of MSMEs when banks are not funding? Laborers are not available, and payment from public sector PSUs of state government and central government are still pending. I think that might be a question. Louis, would you like to address that?
I thought you were asking.
Would you like me to repeat it? I'll repeat it.
No, I've got it. No, so I think we've really lost the plot in terms of helping businessmen. And it's interesting. A friend of mine, we were discussing it a few days back, and they said that for 70 years, the movie business in India have glorified the poor chap, how he came to the top, and every businessman was a crook. And if that's really going to be the perception that's come out from the movie industry, and that's what people see, you're going to start believing it. For 70 years, if you hear that story, you're going to believe it. And unfortunately, therefore, the government also doesn't want to be seen, apparently, the way I look at it today, not that I have access to them, is that they don't want to be seen as helping the private sector. And as a result of it, the aid that's been given to the private sector in India compared to anywhere else in the world is extremely low. And it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt the economy because, as you said, MSMEs have got money locked up with the government. So one of the simple things which has been talked about, in fact, even the Prime Minister said so, and it's amazing that it's still not being able to, all the dues of the government which they owe to the private sector, give it. The electricity boards have so much money locked up. which is owed to the generating companies. This is contractors. Everyone is really squeezed because the government hasn't paid them the dues. So just pay what's due. And and there may be some genuine cases where there was a claim. Maybe pay a part of it, hold back a small part. At the moment, nothing is being paid out. And that's a huge issue. And if you just were to release that money, then the MSMEs and the large corporates will be able to get some stuff done. That's the first point. Secondly is, if they don't have money, if their working capital is being blocked up, and they have huge receivables from the government, and their customers aren't paying them, how do you expect them to pay the salaries of the employees? Because that money has to come from somewhere. So where will that money come from? So that's the challenge we have in the system, that if we believe that private the sector is bad, full of crooks, you're going to find it very difficult to go ahead and take those calls. In 2008, for example, during the global financial crisis, the Fed came in and stepped in, and they had TARP, etc., and they came and rescued a lot of financial institutions, and they took a price for it. The government took a price for it. They took equity in those companies, and they made a profit when those companies recovered. But the point of whether there's profit or not is not relevant. The point is that it kept the economy alive. We're not seeing that happen now. The steps being taken by the central bank aren't bold enough. We're not seeing any bold steps being taken yet, and it boggles the imagination of a lot of us as to why we're not seeing some of these bold steps being taken. We're seeing only incremental stuff being made. And someone was saying this yesterday when we were talking about the COVID response. It was today. One of the professors on a chat conversation I was having, he said that the virus is expanding exponentially, but the steps we're taking are linear. And this guy was a game theory professor, so so clearly that's where he was coming from. But he said that you can't take linear steps when the threat is expanding exponentially. You've got to keep also coming up with measures that are exponential and keep experimenting. Some will go bad, some will go well, and keep on innovating. You can't work in communities. You have to take decisions fast. And today, if people are worried about the CAG or the CVC or all these guys coming to sort of do a post-audit inspection on you, the auditors coming in, you're going to, you're going to be able to, you're not going to allow people to operate. So that's a challenge.
Thanks. Here's a question for you, Christina. Perhaps you'd be, happy to take the stakeholder engagement priorities have been business continuity and reputation management. What are the new dimensions by which such engagement would get measured against?
It's a really good question. And the question of measurement. The question of measurement always has come up, certainly in my career, about rightly about how do we know and how can we measure whether our efforts are making a difference. And when I was young and assumed that everything that my bosses asked me to do, like measure the impact of my group or my efforts in the media, on media relations, or in philanthropy and so on and so forth, when they said, you've got to be able to measure the impact, and I was young, I said, yes, you're absolutely right. And I would try my damnedest. And there are all kinds of companies out there that will tell you, I can measure for you, the degree to which your media coverage is driving your reputation in a positive way. I can measure, and we can all be extremely thoughtful about how we define what we're going to measure in let's say a corporate responsibility program. How much are we engaging with the community? What kinds of stakeholders are we engaging with? What programs are we funding? Are those programs making a difference? And so on and so forth. And I think that those efforts are important, but I will say very bluntly, having been involved in this for, my goodness, over 20 years, that it is extremely difficult to measure these kinds of efforts in any way that is quantitatively valid. And quite frankly, the outcomes of measuring cannot, I believe, drive one's opinion as to whether what one is doing is worth it or not worth it or not worth it. It can be a consideration, but it cannot be the end all and be all. And that is because these efforts ultimately are, one, very squishy. The quantitative measurement of these kinds of efforts is, the deep truth is it's not quantitative and it's not objective and it is subjective. And it is very different measuring the output of widgets and the delta between the cost of producing that widget and the amount charged for that widget and the profit of it. That's something you can measure. But when we're talking about engaging in the community, and when we're talking about assuming explicitly some responsibility for the health and safety of our own employees, our customers, and the communities in which we operate, when we start to really explicitly say, yes, I as a business need to participate in that dynamic, that messy, complicated, never-ending dynamic. When one explicitly owns that that is a necessary thing to do, then measuring it is only one aspect of participating. And there may be a whole slew of activities which are necessary, like engaging with government leaders and community leaders and spending time with them and building relationships and really understanding the nuances of a particular community's challenges. You know, like as Luis and you were saying about about villages and what villages can do, what villages are, the challenges the villages have to really offer the best kind of education. For example, we have the same challenge in the United States. What is the best educational approach we can offer our young people so that they are both nourished intellectually, but also nourished very practically? You know, it is good to both know history and geography and be able to think critically. It is also very good to know how to sew and cook and till a field and be able to make a living. We need both. And when you start getting into and really participating in making that happen, how can you measure whether you're successful or not? Really, only when you can see that it's happening, and it will never be perfect. So that's a bit of a philosophical answer. I confess I tend to get philosophical, but I just don't want perfection to be the enemy of the good. It is good to participate. It is good to engage. It is better to engage than it is to not engage. And don't let the frustrations of measurement stop you or us or anyone from trying to make this world a better place.
Wow. Okay. Now, here's a question which would be relevant really across the globe, and it's generally speaking on companies and corporations related to their commitment to social giving, etc. I mean, the way it's been framed, some of it is specific to do with post 2014. And Christina, for your benefit, 2014 is when the CSR law came into being that you've heard of, right? Where every company has to contribute a minimum of 2% of their profits. So so that's the Corporate Social Responsibility Act that came under the Companies Act, which is, part of the law. But the question here is, and this is why I think it's relevant to both places, and either of you are welcome to opine, or both of you, why are corporates so reluctant to undertake corporate social responsibility in letter and spirit? in India post the 2014 law, and maybe in the US generally speaking? And why are they so unwilling to go beyond philanthropy? I think this is exactly the point, you know. Should they be broadening priorities? Should it only be giving back to society in a small way as a philanthropic effort? But today's experience and the way things have happened is precisely why we have a topic like we do today. So I think I'd love to hear from both of you, and whoever's asked this question would love to hear from both of you.
Should I go first, Christina?
Please go ahead.
Sure. Okay, so you know it's interesting with this the CSR came about and this 2% spend. It actually was preceded by a more interesting paper that got released in 2011. It was called by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, I think, called the National Voluntary Guidelines on Social, Environment, and Economic Responsibility of Business. So I'm going to read out. I'm going to read out they listed 9 principles or core elements of what should be done by businesses. And what's interesting is that all this was forgotten. The only thing got taken was 2% CSR commitment from profits. That's all. And all this was forgotten about. And I think this is that document which was prepared in 2011 was a very good, interesting paper. It listed these 9 principles of what's good business. And I'm going to read this out, so please bear with me. 1, businesses should conduct and govern themselves with ethics, transparency, and accountability. 2, businesses should provide goods and services that are safe and contribute to sustainability throughout their life cycle. 3, businesses should promote the well-being of all employees. 4, businesses should respect the interests and be responsive towards all stakeholders, especially those that are disadvantaged, vulnerable, and marginalized. 5, businesses should respect and promote human rights. 6, businesses should respect, protect, and make efforts to restore the environment. 7, businesses, when engaged in influencing public and regulatory policy, should do so in a responsible manner. 8, businesses should support inclusive growth and equitable development. 9, businesses should engage with and provide value to their customers and consumers in a reasonable manner. So there's nothing rocket science. It's the same points, but that's forgotten. No one talks about that for the last 9 years. That paper I heard about because I used to be on the board of Samhita Social Ventures, and we do CSR advisory. And that's how I heard about it. But the fact is that it all boiled down to 2%. That's what it boiled down to. So therefore, companies sat down and said, okay, how can I do this 2% in a way that makes me look bigger than I am in terms of philanthropy? So as Christina was mentioning, a lot of companies would talk more and do less. Then the government said if you didn't do it, it was, you'd be sort of, hauled up, etc. So therefore, some companies tried to do it. But, effectively, it's all about good citizenship. But I want to come back to Milton Friedman, and I just realized the coffee mug I have is Milton Friedman on it. I didn't realize that. Is that, he said there's a difference between, effectively what you're saying is there's a difference between corporate social responsibility and individual social responsibility. So for example, recently, Amazon announced that they make, I think the annual profit is about $4 billion a year or whatever. They're going to use all that money to spend on supplying equipment to hospitals. PPEs, masks, ventilators, etc. And my point was that, is that really the role of Amazon, the company, or is that the role of Jeff Bezos, who's the richest man on the planet? Why should it impact, if he wants to do good, let it be done from his personal money, as opposed to from the company's money. And similarly, with so many businessmen today, if you sort of, start taking money out of your businesses, your borrowing limits are going to get impacted, your profitability will be impacted, your bank limits, your supply limits, everything is going to get impacted. Rather focus on the business and let the shareholders over there focus on spending money on charity, etc. And we've seen great examples in India. What Azim Premji is doing, fabulous stuff. What the Tatas did, many decades back, fabulous stuff. Why can't there be more such people stepping up and doing this? In fact, we actually started a program called Living My Promise, where normal people like us, anyone who has more than 1 crore, can actually go out over there and pledge that they will give 50% of their money to philanthropy during their life or in their wills. And so it's that role of people helping each other. And we've had a long history about that in India for centuries, for millennia actually. And it's not a Western concept. It's been there with us, from years back. And the Arthashastra talked about it. The Mahabharata talked about it. So it's been as part of our culture. And I think we need to see more of that. Coming back to corporates. So corporates will continue to, in many corporates, will continue to do lip service. Some will do more service than the others. But the fact is that it's a tough market we're in today. And when you are struggling to make business in an economy where people are going to be buying less, can you be spending more on this? It's not an easy situation to be in. We're going to be in a situation for the next few years where people are going to be spending less. Things are going to get more expensive, like flights, for example. It's going to take a long time for the airlines to come back with social distancing if they have fewer seats on the plane. It's either going to reflect in higher costs, travel costs, or subsidies to the airlines. So it's a challenge. And in that environment, to expect people to also, corporates to keep giving, is going to be a challenge.
What's your view from the American perspective?
I think it's a great question, and I think Luis is right. And I think a couple of things. One is, when Luis mentioned Enron at the beginning, I couldn't help but remember Enron.
Yes.
Because in the mid 2000s, Citigroup was a banker to Enron, and long story short, paid something like $4 billion to settle private litigation and regulatory settlements related to Enron, and there were many other issues that Citigroup faced. And there started to be, obviously, everyone was asking, I think regulators were asking, everyone was asking at that time, what is going on at Citigroup? And in fact, there was even I remember an investor presentation where we said literally that we needed to reduce our market share of headline disasters. And in the aftermath of that, one of the things, and I meant to mention this on the previous question about measurement, but maybe it's actually more relevant here. So I think Luis is right. I think business is going to be really grappling with how much, from a monetary perspective, it can, quote unquote, contribute to society. And why, is it just about philanthropy? Why won't companies go beyond philanthropy? Well, what Citi did, because I think Citi did recognize there was some kind of structural or cultural issue that was contributing to, at that time anyway, I'm glad to say I think things have very much changed for the better at Citi. I'm not there anymore, obviously. But what is going on, and what can we do culturally to reduce our market share of headline disasters? And we created these business practices committees, where every time we were going to introduce a new product or make a material change, let's say to the fee structure or the customer base or whatever it might be, but a material change to a product, one of the steps that decision-making process to get to that new product or new change in the product had to go through was it had to go through a business practice committee, where the firm had to ask and answer for its own satisfaction, what is the benefit of this product or product change to our customers? How is it going to affect our customers? How does it align with the regulatory framework in which we operate? Does it align with those, again, hard to measure, squishy expectations of the community in which we operate? And is this, and to the extent that somebody might not like this product and might have a criticism of this product, what is it? What is it? And are we comfortable with dealing with that criticism, or do they have a point? And if they do have a point, what are we going to do to evolve the product or the product change so that we're comfortable that we've addressed that criticism, because we actually think they might have a point. And by going through that process, which I think was sort of a mix of the best of the Socratic method, you know, asking these cosmic questions, you know, is my product good for my customers? What benefit is this product offering my customers and my communities? And let's say it's a fee change. You know, why am I raising this fee? Is there value? Is the value that this product is providing commensurate with the fees I am charging? Am I overcharging? Am I undercharging? And really grappling with these kinds of questions very directly, you start to create a culture where all the things that we've been talking about, you know, making sure that one's business is good and advocating for what's best for employees, for customers, for communities, it starts to actually get right at the core business level. You know, there's nothing more relevant to a business than the product that it wants to bring to market and the fees for which it is going to charge for that product. So really grappling with that, with all the issues that are involved in that in a systematic way, I think gets at, you know, the core role that a business is playing. And back to this question of why can't they go beyond philanthropy? Well, I think it's this kind of process. You know, not everybody needs to have a business practice committee, but it's getting at these, literally what one's business is doing and how one is conducting one's business that gets beyond philanthropy. It would be great, wouldn't it, actually, if businesses didn't feel the obligation to be philanthropic, because all of society's needs were being appropriately addressed through the very structures and inputs of, you know, an ecosystem. We have philanthropy because there are profound gaps in the community. And it's wonderful that businesses try their level best to fill those gaps, but how do you go beyond that? By really grappling with the core questions of how that community operates. And one important aspect of that is literally how business does business, right?
Super, great. Thank you both. Here's a very specific question for you, Louis. An article, the question goes this way. An article on the World Economic Forum mentioned that business leaders should support society in 3 crucial ways: encouraging mental wellness, providing financial security, supporting small businesses. The question is, how could we apply this in India? Can Louis please take this question?
So mental wellness is a huge challenge. I didn't appreciate it till a few years back when we were involved in a mentoring program called Take Charge, and that's when we realized some of the kids we were mentoring needed help. And we asked certain counselors to come in and talk to us about the problem and possible solutions. And that one day, I remember I spending, which maybe about 3-4 years back, was a fabulous day. Just opened my mind to a lot of challenges. So yes, stress, mental health is a huge problem which is ignored by a lot of sort of organizations. It's a problem in schools and colleges, within families, at work. And we're seeing some organizations start doing work on it. The Mariwala Foundation, for example, does a lot of work on this, and so does, for example, Nija Birla, I think it's called MCARES or something like that. But yeah, so some people are doing that, but there's not enough. In fact, I'm involved with a public policy school, and when we decided to get counselors to advise and to help our students, so the challenge finding appropriate number of scholars who are good counselors to do that. So there is a challenge of resources, and yeah, the quick answer, yes, we need to sort of, they need to do a lot more, especially for their own employees. Start up with your own employees. What sort of help can you give them? What sort of, and actually go to the source. Why do some of your employees have that stress? Are you overworking them? Are you not paying them enough, and therefore they're under stress? And try to address some of the basic problems, because then that eases work. Providing financial security, it's a yes. But then again, you come, or supporting small businesses, yes. But then again, you come back to the point, whose role is that? As Christina mentioned, you know, it's easy to say that, okay, corporate India should do that, or corporate America should do that, because it's easy to sort of focus them to do it and, you know, and crack the whip over there. But shouldn't society at large, the government, be fixing some of those problems with better policies? But you can't blame the government, because their processes take time, it's slow. You can't blame society, because I'm never at fault. It's always the other person. And then when you look at, you know, the question made, why can't you sort of, you know, get your supplies from, you know, one of the other questions asked, which hasn't been raised yet. Why can't we buy from smaller communities, from villages, etc., as opposed to buying it from the cheapest person or globally? So today, China became the supplier to the world because they produced it cheaper.
Yeah.
But then if you were to go and buy it from the local village in a non-standardized format, or even if it's standardized, it's going to be more expensive. See, the customer's not going to buy it. So it's fine to say, go so get it from the local person, but then is the customer going to pay the higher price for it? No. So, you know, so it's, you know, it's this great sort of situation I learned at the Center for Civil Society on Public Choice, which is that we've got this constant conflict. Customers want the cheapest price. Businessmen want to make profits. The bureaucracy wants a larger budget. Politicians want to get reelected. Voters want everything for free. And you know, how do you put all that together to come up with a policy that works for everyone? Yes, I mean, corporates will have no problem buying it from the neighboring store, etc. But the price is going to go up. Will the customer pay a higher price for that? So that's something. So when you look at all these things, yes, companies should look at all this stuff. But then there's also a price attached to it. Who's going to pay that price?
And the third aspect was supporting small businesses.
Similar thing. You know, you of course you like to small them, but are these businesses able to supply things on time? Are they able to supply it at quality? And if they do, and if the price is right, of course it makes sense to do so. But it has to be then reflected in the price of the product also. So why is it that? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please. No, so Louis, do you think this can be applied in India? I mean, with some caveats or some you know, initiatives, or do you feel this is a tough one for India in its entirety?
Someone has to pay the price for that. Who's going to pay the price? If the businessman is going to be squeezed on banking limits and a slow economy, and being asked to provide more for social schemes, which the government should be doing, and being asked to fund PM Cares and other sort of aid initiatives, you're killing the business. And if people suddenly realize, listen, I'm not going to make running a business, I'll rather shut down, then more people are going to lose jobs. So, you know, so you've got to keep that balance also in place. And this is not the time to say, you know, you need to sort of do a lot more, because businesses will not be able to survive then. And more jobs will be lost. So keep this in mind. I mean, it's good to be aware of the needs of society, but there is a trade-off between on the cost side.
So that brings me to another question which somebody has asked, though of course the full context is not clear. Do you recommend cross-subsidizing the industry, which is desirable to undesirable?
Well, we've all realized that cross subsidies actually create distorted market forces here. And even that was reflected even in with the electricity companies, where they said we need more transparency on who is benefiting who. And if some society, some sector is being benefited, then the government has to forcibly put in that money for the tariff subsidy, etc. So yes, I mean, you can say it. I mean, the easy answer is, yeah, it's good to have cross subsidies, but it brings in inefficiencies. So you'd rather sort of have transparent pricing and someone fund that subsidy separately.
Okay. Christina, here's one specifically for you. It says, Christina, what are we doing or able to do to help those who are falling through the cracks? The undocumented population who possibly don't file taxes and don't fall under any category to be able to get help from the government. Live 4+ to a room with no room to isolate and are scared to ask for help due to their status. I mean, is that clear to you? I think it's clearer to you than it would be to me, because perhaps the situation's in the US, right?
It is, and it's one of the programs that, in fact, is being offered in the United States is, long story short, a loan program through which, if a company applies for this particular kind of loan, the loan is specifically, pardon me, forget what I just said. Different program. Basically, the U.S. government more or less wrote a check to every person in the United States as sort of a tide over. You probably saw media on this. $1,200 was the maximum amount you might get, and it was capped at an income level. But if you were even married to someone who was not a citizen, you weren't going to get the money. And that, and then to the whoever asked this question, yes, yes, it's so true. There are all kinds of undocumented people who have been working hard, and yes, don't file taxes and are scared, are profoundly scared. And I know some of those people. And I think there's sort of a short-term answer, obviously, and a long-term answer. And my very short-term answer is that we as individuals need to help them however we can, you know, whether it's by supporting them directly and not forgetting them to this issue of mental health, which I think is an absolutely critical issue. It is real, and we all, and the stigma must be eliminated, because everyone in this global world in which we work and live is grappling with some kind of mental stress. So there's the short-term answer of, I just think all of us, hopefully as caring individuals, acknowledge and pay attention to the people we know in our personal lives. But there's, of course, a broader public issue, and I think it goes back to, and this is just my personal opinion. This is Christina Preto talking, as I have been talking for this whole webinar. We need to recognize that the vast population of undocumented workers in the United States are essential. And in fact, there was an interview back to sort of this meat processing question. And as I'm sure many of you know, California, for example, has a vast agricultural economy that absolutely relies on undocumented workers being paid far below the minimum wage in order to pick all those almonds and grapes and pears and oranges and lemons and all those wonderful fruits and vegetables and nuts that we all love to eat so much. And there's this whole rhetoric in our country about workers, not undocumented workers, taking jobs away from America. And to your point, Luis, about cost, there's a little bit of a game going on, right, in my country, because the way so much of our food remains at the prices at which it's sold is because the amount paid to the labor is so low, and no one is, no one is taking a job away from an American because the Americans aren't interested in working under those conditions at those pay levels. So we need to grapple honestly with how our food is produced and gotten to market and what price we're willing to pay. And it's not just an absolute, it's not just a monetary cost. It kind of goes to an economic, it goes to not just economic, a security cost. You start talking about an issue like this, and you pretty quickly get to the question of, well, why are so Latin America coming to the United States for jobs? Well, because they seek economic security for themselves and their family, and they also seek just basic security. It's dangerous to live in some parts of Latin America, quite dangerous. And those security issues are issues that we as Americans need to, in which we need to engage in. I have been wondering, as not fleetingly wondering, and I'll just put it out there, I haven't really voiced this yet, ever. I've not voiced this thought ever. But is this pandemic going to cause us to look differently at issues, not just of trade, but literally of borders? And sovereignty. Are we going to start to have a little bit of a different view of sovereignty? And these kinds of discussions, I think, take place among diplomats and countries and in probably, hotel bar rooms after the big conference. But we're all sitting at home here because a virus manifested itself in a big market. And I want to be very clear, I'm not blaming China, but okay, so this happened in a geographic area we'll call China, that's its name, and it traveled and it didn't know anything about borders and airplanes and maritime rights and air traffic control. It just started hanging out with us. And here, I am in my kitchen. And we've all had this opportunity to sort of think about how we got here. And I just really wonder how, as countries, we're going to relate to one another. And I hope it's more positively. I hope it's more constructively. I hope it's more as partners and not so much as you've got this and what you do affects me. And so I'm going to do this and in retaliation. How can we as countries work more effectively together to protect the human race?
Okay, so lady, I think you seem to have got yourself the last word in there. Louis, we've run out of time. It's been an extremely interesting discussion. Thank you so much, both of you. And I've got a lot of really good questions that have been coming up. I'm hoping at some point in time we'll get a chance to sort of connect and think about it. But I think if I were to quickly just paraphrase one last point, there's no easy solution out of this, right? That's basically it. There's no easy solution, but I also believe, and I refuse to not close with that, which is that there is a lot of potential for collaboration and thinking together. And I don't think, and Louis, you're absolutely right, businesses are there to make money, but I don't think life can be viewed with the same mirror in the same way as we've always done thus far. I think even promoters, corporate leaders, business leaders, big supporters, advisors, and senior business leadership like both of you need to really look at it closely. So with that, on behalf of Indo-American Chamber of Commerce, I'd like to thank both of you for making your time. It's been very valuable listening to your thoughts, sharing with you, and I hope that we will be able to reconnect. And one thing for the audience that I'd like to say is, just one word about Indo-American Chamber of Commerce. It's the preeminent bilateral chamber of commerce for India and the US between. And this is the 51st year of its existence. It was first started, Christina, by the US ambassador then, Chester Bowles, and the government leadership at that point in time. So what I would do is there's a lot of webinars coming up. There are a lot of other benefits that are available. There are a lot of linkages that we can help you with, and would encourage all the audience over here who are not yet members of the IACC to please come forward and register. And you can connect the same person who was your contact person for the webinar as well. And with that, I'd like to say thank you once again. A big thanks on behalf of all of us to Louis Miranda and Christina Preto. And thank you very much to the team who has helped put this together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Madhulika. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Madhulika. Thank you, Louise. Good to meet you.
Someday